And when I really stared down that fact, it became very, very hard for me to cling to this idea that it was okay to accept a certain degree of poverty or lack of wealth in being an academic, and to really say, you know what, like actually I want to have some nice things, and I'm not sure I'm willing to be ashamed of that anymore.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts. This is Season 10, Episode 7, and today my guest is Dr. Chris Katerine, the author of Leaving Academia, A Practical Guide, which was published 1 year ago. Chris holds a PhD in classics and worked as a visiting assistant professor before transitioning into a career in the private sector. Leaving Academia addresses the necessary identity shift and practical steps that accompany this process and grew out of the informational interviews Chris conducted. Chris and I discussed the financial pressures that motivated Chris to shift to a non-academic career and how to financially prepare for that challenge. We also discussed the role side hustles and volunteer experiences can play in helping you land a non-academic job. This episode is a must listen for anyone currently in PhD training or working in academia. Did you know that I run a couple of database websites for collecting stipend and salary information for PhD trainees? The domains are phdstipends.com and postdocsalaries.com. If you haven't done it yet, would you please take a minute to 1. Fill out the survey to report your 2021-2022 stipend or salary to the appropriate website. The databases consist of crowdsourced information, so they rely on the willingness of PhD trainees like you to self-report their income. 2. Share the site with your peers over a social network, a listserv, or a forum website. These websites are super useful for prospective PhD students and postdocs, but they are also often used for advocacy efforts to bolster the case for raising stipends and salaries. Thank you so much for participating in these efforts. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Chris Katerine. I am delighted to have joining me on the podcast today, Dr. Chris Katerine. He is the author of the new book, Leaving Academia, A Practical Guide. And I'm super delighted to have him on because we're going to be talking about career changes, graduate students and PhDs and academics who are leaving academia, and how personal finance relates to that process. So I'm super excited. Chris, will you please introduce yourself a little bit further for the audience?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Emily. Again, I'm Chris Katerine. I'm a communications strategist and proposal writer for a global consulting firm. My academic career was actually in classics, which is Greek and Roman literature, history, and all of that stuff. I got my PhD in 2014 from the University of Virginia. And as Emily said, last year, I had a book published called Leaving Academia, A Practical Guide with Princeton University Press.
Fabulous. And in the book, it talks a lot about your own journey as well as what you learned from others. And there were lots and lots of interviews which went into the book, which was fascinating. Can you just tell us, like, quick synopsis? What's the book about? What do you want the reader to do with it?
The book is really designed to do two things. The first thing is that I'll go to the practical side, which is to say, if you are in academia and you realize that you don't have a career future in academia, which 93% of entering social sciences and humanities graduate students don't, then the book gives you practical steps. Just put one foot in front of the other and figure out what you need to do to find a new career, even if you have no idea what that's going to be. And that practical side of the book, again, is good for everybody, not just the humanities and social science, but STEM folks as well. The other side of the book is almost more psychological or identity driven. And that's really trying to get into the mindset of people who can't imagine having any career besides a professorship. And how do you approach what is ultimately an identity crisis, not just knowing what you'll do, but not knowing who you'll be if you leave the academy. That, I think, does tend to drive more towards the humanities and social sciences side because there have always been more industry outs for people in STEM. But really, it applies to anybody who views academia as a vocation and feels called into that line of work and realizes that that might not be their future.
I love the way you described that. And I also loved, I don't remember if it was the introduction or something, but you sort of positioned what your book adds to the field already, because I don't know if I read some of the exact same books you're referencing, but I read the kind of book that you're referencing, which is like a lot of like personal essays or like individual stories around careers that people have after they, get out of graduate school or finish their PhD. And that's wonderful to see examples of what's going on. But your book is more about, okay, what is the actual, like logistically, like what is the process here? Like, what do I actually do to get to that end point that I see as possible? And I really appreciated that. And of course, I love, and I'm sure everybody loves, that these 6 chapters have alliteration for all the titles to them. So I'll just read them out because I have the book here. Dread, discern, discover, decipher, develop, and deploy. And I actually found, I thought my favorite parts of it were actually in decipher, when you were talking about, I don't know if you use this term, but the translatable skills that you develop in academia and how they actually relate to other jobs you could do later. And I know I'd always heard that in graduate school. You have translatable skills, you can use them later, but like your exploration was just more detailed than anything I'd read before, which I found really delightful and made me feel a little bit better about the things that I learned while I was in academia. So thank you for that. So delightful book. And as I said, it was driven by all these informational interviews that you did, and you did more in-depth interviews for the book. But I wanted to know about sort of your motivation for leaving academia. And it's apparent from the book that finance has played at least some role in that. So would you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, really for me, I think I began accepting that I was going to be leaving academia around age 30. It sounds a little bit cliche, but it was a big transition point, even if I didn't want to admit it. And I was getting to that stage of life where, my wife and I had been married for a few years. We were thinking that we would probably want to start a family at some point. And I just remembered looking at all of these jobs I was applying to. I was making $40,000 a year teaching at 3.3 as a visiting assistant professor. And I was applying for jobs like that were apart from my wife. And I was saying, well, first of all, how do we have kids if we're living apart? That doesn't really work. But also like just doing the math on the salary and trying to think, okay, if we're trying to live in 2 places, that's 2 households, 40, 50, even $60,000 a year. Like this just like the math doesn't work. And on top of that, even if we lived in the same place, somehow, solve the 2-body problem, because my wife is also an academic, or still is an academic, not longer. Even if we solve that, I looked at it and said, I don't know that my wife and I would be able to give any child or children in the future anything resembling the quality of life that our parents gave us. And when I really stared down that fact, it became very, very hard for me to cling to this idea that it was okay to accept a certain degree of poverty or lack of wealth in being an academic, and to really say, like brass tacks, actually, I want to have some nice things, and I'm not sure I'm willing to be ashamed of that anymore.
So interesting. I mean, really what you're talking about here is a realization of your own values as you grew, towards age 30 and so forth, and realizing that the career, which is one of your values, I'm sure that aligned in some way with your values, was in conflict with these other values of what is the standard of living that I want, what is the kind of family that I want. And you resolved, I assume, this conflict by having a career outside of academia that still, I'm again assuming, fulfills many of your values and so forth. But this book is about the process of finding that and landing that career. I'm just wondering, because we've heard this story before a similar story before on the podcast. I'll refer listeners to the episode with Dr. Scott Kennedy, who, similar to you, came into academia aspiring to the professoriate, and during graduate school got married and actually had, I think, 2 or 3 children during graduate school, and realized that it was just not tenable financially, and exited academia and found fulfillment elsewhere. So that was a wonderful example. But I want to know, okay, you just mentioned, as a visiting assistant professor, the $40K salary. Did you know, like back when you were in graduate school, that was your financial future if you stayed in academia, or did you have like a rosier picture? Like what did you think was going to happen?
Well, in grad school, I was living on an $18,000 a year stipend, so I figured anything more than that would make me rich. I mean, I literally just saw it as double the buying power. And of course, that isn't actually the case. Taxes increase if you're living with a partner. Like maybe you have 2 incomes, but you need more space for the 2 of you. The costs do not kind of move up in a linear way. And so I sort of expected that as my salary went up in a linear way, that the cost would track, and they just don't actually in a lot of ways. And so I really worked hard to live on that that 18 a year. It's funny, I was looking at my pandemic hair, which is getting all too long in the back. And I was thinking, man, it hasn't been this long since graduate school. And I'm like, oh yeah, like I got one haircut a fiscal quarter for $12 at a place, a 20-minute drive away, because I wanted to not put money into that and save it for, drinks out, whatever it was. And so I think I just assumed that like my spending was so low that anything that I brought in would let me do infinitely more. And part of that was that I was living in a low cost area. And part of that was that I just didn't understand how those costs scaled. And part of it was that, at age 22, the prospect of kids was a long way off. And then you start thinking about it, you say, oh, I have 18 years to save, $350,000 for college. That's not going to work, right, on 40 a year. The math just doesn't track. So that was I think my thinking definitely changed later on. But in graduate school, I just assumed that it would be okay.
And I think that, you said earlier, it's cliche, approaching my 30th birthday, I had all these, realizations or whatever. But I think that your story, again, is common, that as we age, we realize that we want a higher standard of living than what we were enduring during graduate school. And the other thing, you mentioned this, I think, somewhere in your book, that during graduate school, I don't believe that you were contributing to your retirement. That was something you were able to do only once you had your, full-time job and so forth. And so there's also this like sort of deferred costs, like you're pushing off responsibility to the future for yourself. And so, maybe 40K is not actually double 18K because you have XYZ taxes and retirement and all these other things, maybe a house, maybe a family, all these other things you want to do. So I totally understand. And it's the same, experience that I have as well. Do you find that financial strain in academia is a common motivator for leaving academia for other people?
Yeah, a lot of people I've spoken with do raise that issue. And I would say that the stories vary a lot, because there are some people who say, I have a ton of debt, I have nothing in savings, and I'm done with graduate school in 3 months. Can you help me? And that's a big ask. I can give advice. I can tell you maybe how to prioritize that 3 months that you have, but that's a challenging situation. For other people, they see it a little bit earlier on, and maybe they realize that things won't work out financially. For other people, especially in the US, healthcare becomes an issue as well. I would say that is a big motivating factor for a lot of people. And I think as you do get closer to completing, and as you start applying for jobs and thinking about, incurring the cost to move for a job that pays you $30,000, there's just that's going to cost you a few thousand anyway. You're kind of running negative on that deal. I think when people start actually thinking about that or trying it out a few times and seeing how it works out, the finances do become a big issue. And especially looking at salaries outside of the academy, it's just wild. I mean, I felt rich when I went from my 18,000 to 40,000 as a visiting assistant professor, and I didn't realize just how small a salary that was until I began looking outside.
Yeah, my husband is also a PhD, and he and I went through a similar thing, going from like graduate student to postdoc salary, but then realizing, oh wait, we're paying FICA now? Okay, it doesn't go that far. So I'm actually wondering, you mentioned near the start of the interview that only maybe 7%-ish of people who start a PhD program will actually end up in a tenure track job. And I think one of the issues that maybe is not discussed head on, but certainly indirectly in your book, is the problem of contingent faculty, right? So if you get the tenure track job, then maybe you are on a decent salary path. I mean, I don't know about your field necessarily, but I have certainly run across many citations of professors making over 100K a year, and even 150 or more. But that's not at the contingent level, the visiting level, the adjunct level. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of the strain that on the personal finances of contingent faculty as they're maybe holding out hope of this, this ultimate dream job?
This one really breaks my heart. And one of the things that actually precipitated my move outside of academia was working on contingent faculty issues for my professional society. So that was the first time I really started to look at what life could be like. And when you start hearing figures that something like, I want to say it's like 54% of adjuncts qualify for food stamps, that like 20, I can't remember all this off the top of my head now, but I mean, the numbers are really bleak, and you start realizing like, oh my God, this is severe. And as a society, we're essentially subsidizing these universities to not pay people. Like, why are we doing this? Why do we put up for it? I think the thing that really crushes me so much now when I talk to people in contingent roles who say, well, I want to try one or two more times, is that they are missing out on the opportunity cost of the situation as well. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, you can try to get an academic job one or two more times, and maybe you have a 3 to 5% chance of getting one. But all the time that you spend on those applications, all the money you spend flying to the conference to interview for the job, whatever it is, all of that time and money could be put into other things that could be preparing you for a career that actually makes you happier than being an academic and gets you out from under the thumb of this system that is fundamentally broken. And convincing people of that, if they've bought into the idea that their identity is tied up in being a professor, is very, very hard. And there's sort of only so much that you can do to get people to move past that. And I hope, in the early chapters of my book, Dread, I give it a dire title, because I'm trying to shake that sense into some people who maybe are resistant to it. But really, for some people, it is just a matter of going out and seeing what that's like. But I would encourage all of your listeners to really go out and read some stories of what contingent life is actually like financially. It's not a good situation.
Emily here for a brief interlude. If you are a fan of this podcast, I invite you to check out the Personal Finance for PhDs community at pfforphds.community. The community is for PhDs and people pursuing PhDs who want to take charge of their personal finances by opening and funding an IRA, starting to budget, aggressively paying off debt, financially navigating a life or career transition, maximizing the income from a side hustle, preparing an accurate tax return, and much more. Inside the community, you'll have access to a library of financial education products, including my recent set of Wealthy PhD workshops. There is also a discussion forum, monthly live calls with me, and progress journaling for financial goals. Our next live discussion and Q&A call is on Wednesday, September 22nd, 2021. Basically, the community exists to help you reach your financial goals, whatever they are. Go to pfforphds.community to find out more. I can't wait to help propel you to financial success. Now back to the interview. Chris, I know we could stay on this subject for quite a while, and I wish we could, but let's talk a little bit more about money mindset, specifically for you. So, what was your attitude towards money, practice of personal finance when you were in graduate school versus did it change later on as you became a visiting assistant professor, as you moved into your non-academic job?
So growing up, both my parents were trained as CPAs. I had a pretty decent financial literacy growing up in that, I knew how to balance a checkbook. I knew how to make at least a basic budget and make sure that there was more money coming in than going out, and use that to sort of set my discretionary spending accordingly. So I'd been doing that sort of all the way through graduate school, and had adapted pretty well to a very modest standard of living, and I was proud of doing it, and I still am, that I did it. But as time went on, I think especially when I moved to New Orleans, I grew up in Boston, went to school in Virginia. When I ended up in New Orleans, I saw a very different mode of life, and people here definitely embrace the better things in life. There's good music, good food, good drink, and I started saying, wait a minute, why am I deferring all of that 100%? And so my wife and I made a choice to live in a smaller apartment so that we could afford to dine out in New Orleans, thinking we'd only be here for 1 year. Well, 8 years later, here we are. So, geography sort of changed my outlook on what I actually wanted to be doing with my money, not just squirreling it away in the bank, but using it to enjoy life. And I think I also ended up going from being extremely risk averse in graduate school, just because there wasn't that much. So if I lost any of it, I felt it more, to over time just becoming a little bit more comfortable with risk. And for me, leaving academia was actually a process of embracing risk and embracing financial risk in a way that I hadn't before. So I had 1 year left on my visiting assistant professor contract, and my wife and I had decided that we wanted to stay in New Orleans no matter what. And we decided to buy a house. And I was terrified of that decision because we could afford the monthly payments for the next year, but I had no idea what was coming after. I hadn't really built a good network. I didn't have good leads on jobs. It was a big question mark. And I actually used that life event to sort of put my back against a wall and say, like, if there's the prospect of losing this house, if I don't figure something out, then I better figure something out. And that was a huge motivator to me. I was in a privileged position to be able to do that, but that was sort of the rationale, was using a financial tool to push me into a space that I was uncomfortable.
I think I've heard this referred to as like a commitment device. Like there's going to be some real big downside if I do not follow through on my goal of XYZ. I've heard it in a lower stakes situation than home ownership, but I think this qualifies as well. And, I think what you said earlier about the opportunity cost of that particular example is the opportunity cost of staying in a contingent faculty position, doing 1, 2, 3 more, cycles on the job market. There's also major opportunity cost to graduate school. There's also major opportunity cost at staying at these lower salary levels. So you said, I had to think about risk in a different way. I had to be willing to take on more risk. There was implicit risk in what you were already doing, but it probably wasn't forefront in your mind, right? Like the risk of spending years and years and years pursuing this career that was not working out financially, was never going to work out financially. But it's so hard to see that. It's hard to see graduate school as opportunity cost.
It is. And I think the biggest challenge with the PhD right now is really that if you want to be a professor, it is a credential that you need to get. So if you want to keep the professorship open as a possibility for your future, that is the only path. You have to do it. And yet the vast, vast majority of people who get a PhD can't become professors. And I think because of that tension, people do get sucked into this mentality that you just need to forge ahead, and anything that you do that deviates from your scholarship or your teaching is ultimately going to be lessening your odds of that thing that you're working towards. So it feels like a risk-averse position to be overly narrow when actually it's not.
Very well phrased. You mentioned earlier an example of, someone coming to you for advice who has 3 months until they're not being paid anymore and they have a lot of debt and so forth. And you're saying, oh, it's a short time frame. We can do something here. But let's say that, some listeners have a longer time frame, a year or more before they're thinking about exiting academia. What can that person do to help prepare their finances for this process of leaving academia?
I would say, save every penny that you can, because at a certain point, you can actually buy time. And what I mean by that is that if you have, 3 months of expenses in the bank, then even after your last paycheck hits, you will not necessarily need to take the first job that comes your way. And if you are making a major career change, from a planned academic path to something totally different, it is likely that the first offer that you get is not going to be a job you want. And I cite these examples in the book, but I was interviewing for jobs to pour samples of beer at the grocery store. I was offered a job to sell life insurance, which seemed like a really good idea going through the interview process until I stopped to think about it and then said, wait a minute, like actually this whole thing, the financial arrangement that they put before me was a scam. And I had, friends and family fortunately say, like, yes, we didn't want to be discouraging, but that would be a bad idea. And because I had some savings in the bank, because I had a partner with a stable income, we looked at the numbers and said, okay, I can probably wait 3 to 6 months after that last paycheck. And then at that point, I'll need to shift my mindset into either take anything that's available or begin looking outside of New Orleans and consider potentially having to uproot. But the more you can save, the more flexibility you will have to make a sort of a positive choice at that end game instead of being backed into something that you're not totally happy with.
I'm in total agreement. And if someone were to follow this process in your book, it's very deliberate and it takes a good amount of time, not just like the number of hours, but sort of longitudinally for you to be able to process and understand what's going on and make the networking connections and so forth. It takes quite a bit of time. So to give yourself that runway, it's the same thing with entrepreneurship. Give yourself runway before your paycheck ends, or, if you can give yourself runway with savings, the more you can, the less of a desperate situation you will end up in eventually. And hopefully, as you said, you can make a positive career choice. And so I really enjoyed that you talked about in the chapter Develop how a side hustle can further this whole process. And I think in that chapter, you were specifically citing side hustles as a way for you to sort of add to your resume, add more experiences, demonstrate your skills, that sort of thing. But I think that side hustles could probably be helpful in multiple stages of this process of leaving academia. Can you talk about the benefits that you've seen of pursuing a side hustle?
For me, what I will say first of all is that in graduate school, the only side hustle I had was tutoring, which was great because it got me some extra money, but it was also a really foolish thing to do because it didn't get me anything besides that money. Like, it didn't actually make me a better teacher. It didn't develop any new skills. It just sort of deepened my presence in a space that I was already in. So if you're thinking of doing that and you just need a little bit of extra cash, okay, fine. But again, think about opportunity cost. How could you spend that time? Could you get more than $15 or $20 an hour tutoring to do something else? In that regard, I got lucky. I had a neighbor and a close friend who had a small business. It was him and one other developer, and he just needed somebody to help with website development and maintaining his books and doing all this stuff that I had no idea how to do. And I knew him well enough that he said, well, I can pay you. I think he gave me $15 an hour. And he said, I know that me giving you $15 an hour to do it is going to free up time for me to bill my clients. And it's going to let you learn some skills. And it's probably, you're going to figure it out faster than somebody I'd pay $35. So I'm good. Now I got lucky with that situation, but it was great because I brought in a little bit of extra money, but I also began thinking about, okay, how do you sell a business service to a buyer who's probably resistant to incurring that expense in the first place? Where do you go to advertise to small and mid-tier businesses for kind of a small Salesforce.com development group? So I began thinking in all these different ways, and it turned out that all that practice talking about technology services for maybe skeptical business audiences really paved the way for the stuff I'm doing now, where most of the time I'm working on proposals for big technology implementations. I had no idea that would pan out, but that's sort of how it did. So I think to get back to the core of the question, how can side hustles really help? You don't know how they could help, but I think you want to use them as a way to simultaneously build new skills and make some extra money. And if you let them do double duty, then that's great. My wife has a saying now, which is she doesn't do anything that doesn't count twice. And if she can't kind of apply it in two places, it's not worth doing because the time investment is just too high. So I think it's a really good attitude to take as you're exploring new careers, as you're trying to, make extra money in graduate school or even beyond graduate school. Tutoring, working in a restaurant, all that stuff can, yes, get you money, but is it going to be advancing those other career objectives that you have? If the answer is no, then you might want to think again about how to balance that equation.
Yeah, you're absolutely speaking my language here. I have an interview with Dr. Gaius Augustus, which we'll link in the show notes, where we talk through this framework that I have thinking about how valuable a side hustle will be to you. My favorite side hustle I call career advancing side hustles. Double duty, as you said, it brings in money and also helps you demonstrate a skill, learn a new skill, have another line for your CV, expand your network, anything like that. And I think what was interesting about your example of keeping the books for your friend's business is that you didn't know how that experience was going to advance your career, and it turned out it did in retrospect. And I think that just speaks to the benefit of like trying something new. And as you said, instead of staying in the same space that you already know, tutoring, it's in your wheelhouse already. Try to stretch yourself a little bit, and it'll spark new thoughts and it'll spark new perspectives. And so, yeah, just give some new things a chance. And I noticed from that chapter of your book, it seemed like you were pursuing this side hustle, maybe, some other volunteer experience and so forth over a fairly short period of time. And you got a lot out of it over just like a few months, 6-month period or something. And so it doesn't have to be like, oh, I have to set this up and do it the entire time I'm in graduate school. No, just try something. If, see if you benefit from it. If it's good pay and you do, keep doing it, or not, try something else. Just experiment with it.
Yeah, in software development, they have this concept of failing fast. And the idea is that it's good to experiment and try little things. And like the sooner you find out something doesn't work, the sooner you can stop spending time doing that thing. And so I think that sort of agile and iterative approach to trying new stuff to build career skills is absolutely the right path.
I think the other benefit is that, working for your friend's business for a bit, it gave you some language probably that you didn't have before, not just the skills, but just that practice, as you said, of speaking with people you weren't speaking with already inside academia, and just that diversity of experience helped you ultimately, get the job that you have, because I know you said in the book that it took practice to change the kind of language that you used, the kind of speech that you used from what you were used to in academia to what was acceptable in the business world. And that exposure can help a person, along with that process.
Yeah, it's maybe expected that a communication strategist would say that like career changes ultimately come down to communication. But in this case, I really do think that that's the biggest challenge, is just that academics speak their own language, their own jargon. We have ways of interacting with people that are different from the world outside. And until you go out there and learn how other people speak and behave, trying to translate is a fool's errand. It would be like me trying to translate Latin into Mandarin. I can't do it until I know Mandarin.
Chris, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad you came on the podcast. I know we're leaving the listeners wanting more. So where can they find you and where can they find your book?
So I'm available on Twitter at CL Caterine, also on LinkedIn, Christopher L. Caterine. My book is available through Princeton University Press on Amazon and also at local independent bookstores.
Very good. And by the way, hat tip to Dr. Brandon Renfro, who connected us, and you can listen to his episode. We will link that in the show notes as well. So Chris, the question that I ask all my guests at the end of our interviews is, what is your best financial advice for another early career PhD? So would you please share that with us?
We alluded to this earlier, and I think budgeting is a really valuable tool, and you should absolutely do it. But sort of don't be tricked by thinking that the budget that you set for yourself as a graduate school is going to scale up. And run models, figure out what you might need to have the sort of life you want to live, and use that to figure out what kind of income you would need from a job to live that life. And if you have real data that backs it up, you can be really targeted in the jobs you pursue, both inside and outside the academy, and find a career that works for your life.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful exercise to couple with all the exercises that you lay out in your book. So thank you so much again for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having
me. Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. On that page are links to all the episode show notes, which include full transcripts and videos of the interviews. There is also a form to volunteer to be interviewed on the podcast. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here are 4 ways you can help it grow. 1, subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever platform you use. 2, share an episode you found particularly valuable on social media, with an email listserv, or as a link from your website. 3, recommend me as a speaker to your university or association. My seminars cover the personal finance topics PhDs are most interested in, like investing, debt repayment, and effective budgeting. I also license pre-recorded workshops on taxes. 4, subscribe to my mailing list at pfforphds.com/subscribe. Through that list, you'll keep up with all the new content and special opportunities for personal finance for PhDs. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing by Lourdes Bobbio and show notes creation by Miriam Ock.